Hey guys, John here, and welcome back to the Synthmaster 3 tutorial course. Today we're going to take a look at the scalar modulation source. Now, the scalar is interesting because we can create custom shapes and curves, and we can use that as a modulation source, either unipolar or bipolar. And this might kind of sound like a multi-stage envelope, but the key feature with a scalar is that we can use another source that influences how it behaves. So if that sounds confusing, let's start putting this into practice. So from a fresh preset, let's add a scalar. Let's go down here to the gear icon, go to add new, and then let's add a scalar. So now what we see here is a curve, a linear curve going from left all the way to right. So let's say we go over here to the oscillator volume. Let's bring this all the way down. Let's grab our scalar, drag and drop here so we have full modulation. And we can even change the tension of this curve if we want to, but let's keep it kind of linear for now. So what's essentially going to happen is that if we look down here at the bottom, this source by default is going to be on key track. So we're essentially key tracking this parameter here, in this case, the volume. So the lower notes of the keyboard that we play, the quieter the volume, the higher notes that we play, the louder the volume. So even if we go down here to something like this, and then something up here like this, we can see how much difference the modulation is. And as we start going like this, we can start to see this move a little bit as well. So let's try that one more time. Now, by default, this is going to be on key track, what we're doing right now. However, there's a lot of different things that we can change as well. So we can click here on key track. We can go down here to MIDI. And for example, we can select something like the mod wheel. So now our mod wheel is all the way down. If we hit some notes, we can see it's triggering, but the volume's still down here at the bottom. However, once we start increasing this, it starts to get a little bit louder because we mapped it here to the volume. And we can bring it back down again here. And all the way back to the bottom, which we shouldn't hear anything here. And all the way at the top, we should hear the maximum volume. So basically, this is going to be a relationship between this curve on the volume here in this point right here, and then the source is going to be the mod wheel in this case. So from a fresh preset, let's take a look at the bipolar signal of the scalar, and in this case, we're going to be using the pan. So again, go to the gear icon, let's go down to add new, and then click on scalar. Now by default, it's going to be unipolar, so down here on the bottom left, let's go ahead and click bipolar. So we have a point down here at the bottom and up here on the top. So what we could do now is drag and drop this to our pan. So now this connection is made. So by default, this source is again on key track. So as we start playing the lower notes, those are going to be panned more in the left speaker, and then the higher notes are going to be more panned in the right speaker. So this is somewhat of a smooth curve right here. We could do something kind of drastic if we double click in here, make a point kind of like this. And then there's going to be a point where it's going to instantly cross over. So all the signals either going to be in the left or it's only all going to be in the right. So these two notes right here, where these land, is going to be exactly where this curve lands here as well. So this note all the way on the right is going to be landing on this right-hand side of that waveform, and then this one is going to be all the way on the left as well. And we can also change this if we don't always want key track. We have a lot of different things to pick from. So we can go to a macro. Let's go to easy one, for example. And as we start playing notes, we can essentially tell this knob or tell our notes where on the stereo field it's going to be. So if I bring this to our right, we're basically panning this to the right, and to the left, we're panning this to the left as well. So starting from a fresh preset once more, let's take a look at the bottom controls of the scalar. So again, let's go to our gear icon, add new, and then go back to scalar. Now we just talked about the bipolar, right? We're changing a unipolar signal to a bipolar signal. However, the next one here is called tie, and by default, this is going to be off. So what exactly does this mean? So if we double click here and add a point, we're basically making 2 points with these two squares right here. Now these are not going to be tied together. Now if we right click it and remove it, now we select tie. Now we can double click and we're essentially having 1 point and we're tying this point together. So that's going to be the difference between these two. We also have grid X and grid Y if we want a little bit more precision. So we can scroll with our mouse wheel if we want a grid here. Let's say maybe we want to do something like 12, and then grid Y, maybe we can scroll up and maybe do something like 10. So now we have this grid where we can start moving these grid points and kind of make this a little bit more precise. So something very important to keep in mind is that down here on the bottom right, this source menu, right, we've looked at key tracking, we've looked at using the macro, this easy one, we've looked at using the mod wheel. However, once we start adding LFOs and modulation sources, those types of things are going to start populating in this list, and it's going to be something that we can select, which will influence the scalar's behavior. So let's take a look at that. So again, we're starting here from a fresh preset. So let's do something again with our pan. So let's first go to this gear icon. Let's add new and let's add an LFO, for example. And maybe this guy, let's go to sync and then let's maybe turn this to 1 bar, something kind of like that. And then again, now let's go to the gear icon and go to add new, and then we're going to add a scalar. So we're going to do this with a pan again. So let's go to bipolar, same kind of deal, right? We have the one on the bottom and then we have the one on the top. So let's drag and drop this here to the pan. And right now, again, we're on key tracking. But let's use the LFO. So we're going to go down to source. Let's click this and we see LFO is now populated in the list, and we see LFO1, which is this guy. So let's go ahead and select this. And once we start playing a note, we can see this oscillating the pan. Now, at first you might think, okay, this is doing exactly what the LFO would originally do if we just map this directly to the pan. And yes, you're correct. So what's essentially happening is this is going back and forth, taking the LFO shape into consideration. Now, this is the cool part. So once we start making points here, we can start adjusting things like this here and moving things around. It's still going to go back and forth, but it's also going to take the LFO shape into account. So let's take a listen to that. And now if we go to our LFO and maybe make this a little bit slower so we can kind of see a little bit more what's going on here. So essentially, as this goes back and forth, these values are telling the LFO that it's going to change how this pan knob works. So if we start right-clicking here, maybe deleting things again like that here. So we're here at the bass spot once again. And we're slowly going back and forth. And then it goes back to the middle. And then back to the left here. So if we did something like this here, let's add another point, let's double click here. And if we did something kind of like that, now we're essentially going to have the same thing almost repeated, and we're going to see that reflected here in the pan again. So hopefully now you can start to see how cool this is, right? We can have our main shape, whether it's an LFO, an envelope, something like that. And when we set this as the source, then it's going to take that into consideration. And also this shape that we make here is going to influence that modulations behavior. So definitely something to spend some time with. It might take a little bit of time to wrap your head around, but it's a very cool feature and I highly recommend to use it. So thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you learned something, and we'll see you in the next one.